It started with a handshake between Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler. But what followed wasn't a military plan. It was something far darker. Deep in the shadows of Nazi Germany, a secret program called Lebensborn began. Its goal was to breed the perfect Aryan race. Babies were made through cold strategy, not love. Mothers were selected, fathers chosen, and the children treated like property. What happened in these breeding farms was beyond terrifying. It started in September 1935, when the Nazi regime introduced the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of citizenship and banned marriage or sexual relations between Germans and anyone considered non-Aryan. These laws didn't just target Jews. They also applied to Romani people, Black Germans, Slavs, and even Germans with mental or physical disabilities. Anyone who didn't fit into the Nazi racial ideal was labeled a threat to Germany's future. The Nazi vision of an Aryan was highly specific. It included Nordic features like light hair, pale skin, and blue eyes. But it wasn't just about looks. It was about bloodlines. The Nazis believed that Aryans were genetically superior and meant to rule over others. Adolf Hitler wanted this master race to dominate not just Germany, but all of Europe. And to make that happen, the population had to be reshaped from the inside out. That's where Heinrich Himmler came in. As head of the SS, Himmler had full control over racial policy, police forces, and internal security. He believed Germany was in danger of losing its best blood. War, low birth rates, and racial mixing were, in his view, weakening the German people. So in late 1935, just months after the Nuremberg Laws were passed, Himmler created the Lebensborn program under the SS Race and Settlement Office. Its goal was to encourage the birth of as many racially pure Aryan children as possible. The first Lebensborn home opened in December 1935 in Steinhöring, a quiet village just east of Munich. On the surface, it looked like a normal clinic, a clean, quiet place for pregnant women. But in reality, it was the first building in a disturbing project that treated motherhood like a breeding operation. The women chosen for the program weren't random. Every one of them had to go through strict racial evaluations. Their ancestry was checked back at least 4 generations, often using church records, birth certificates, and family archives. Their bodies were measured, including skull size, nose shape, and eye color. Even dental health was considered part of the racial profile. Most were between 16 and 30 years old, unmarried and in good physical condition. They had to be free of any hereditary defects or genetic illnesses. Doctors and SS racial examiners approved only those who fit this rigid image of a healthy Aryan woman. Some of these women were volunteers, loyal Nazi supporters who believed they were serving the Reich. Others came from families involved in Nazi youth organizations like the Bund Deutscher Mädel or League of German Girls. In rare cases, the women were widows of fallen SS men, offered a place to give birth in secret away from social shame. A portion of these women were already in relationships with SS officers, and Lebensborn gave them a way to give birth outside of marriage without public disgrace. Nazi ideology didn't punish illegitimacy, as long as both parents were racially valuable. But most of these women didn't fully understand what they were entering. They were told they were doing a patriotic duty, replenishing Germany's future with healthy Aryan babies. The state offered free medical care, good food, and clean living conditions, which were rare in a time of economic stress. For some, this was a way out of poverty. For others, it was a deeply unsettling experience, filled with shame, secrecy, and fear. The male side of the program was just as carefully controlled. Only SS officers and a few other hand-selected men could father Lebensborn children. These men had already gone through their own racial vetting to join the SS. Himmler believed that they represented the best blood in Germany, loyal, pure, and disciplined. Marriage was not a requirement. In fact, by 1937, SS men were officially encouraged to father children outside of marriage with racially approved women. Himmler even wrote letters to SS units stating that having children for the Reich was more important than traditional morality. It was a radical shift, even for the time. By 1938, the Lebensborn program had produced hundreds of births, and its reach was growing quickly. What began as a small hidden project in Bavaria was turning into a full-scale operation that would soon cross German borders. It was quickly introduced after the Anschluss in March 1938, when Germany annexed Austria. The first Austrian home was set up in Vienna under the supervision of SS officials. It became a key center for managing both births and adoptions. Women from rural Austrian communities were brought in for racial screening, and children born there were often sent to German families for proper upbringing. In 1939, following the occupation of Czechoslovakia and later Poland, Lebensborn personnel moved in to manage both pregnancies and the forced Germanization of local populations. Polish children with Aryan features were taken from orphanages or directly from families and transferred into the Lebensborn system. The home in Litzmannstadt, now Łódź, Poland, became one of the key sites for these activities. In Norway, where German forces arrived in April 1940, the situation developed differently. The local population was seen by the Nazis as racially valuable, especially women who matched the Nordic look. The SS considered Norwegian genes high quality, making the country a prime location for Lebensborn expansion. The most prominent facility, Herdalsværk, opened near Oslo and was operated by the SS from 1941 onward. Here, Norwegian women were often recruited or manipulated into relationships with German soldiers. Around 10 Lebensborn homes had been opened in Norway alone. The offspring from these unions, later known as Tyskerbarnas, or German children, numbered over 10,000. The program also spread to Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and Denmark, where smaller homes and administrative centers were created to manage both births and racial selection. In France, some of these homes were disguised as welfare centers to avoid backlash from the public. By 1944, there were more than 30 official Lebensborn homes across occupied Europe, not counting the many unofficial facilities run under SS control. Each home operated under strict SS oversight, with detailed records kept for every mother, child, and prospective adoptive family. As the war dragged on and Nazi manpower was stretched thin, the program took a darker, more violent turn. In occupied Poland after the invasion in September 1939, SS racial experts and officers began evaluating local populations for racial value. Special units called the Ruscha, SS Race and Settlement Main Office, were deployed to screen both women and children. Polish girls, some as young as 15, were abducted and sent to Lebensborn homes in Wrocław, Łódź, and Poznan. They were held there under guard and often impregnated by SS personnel, entirely without consent. In Czechoslovakia, the Nazis targeted ethnic Germans first, but soon expanded the program into local populations, especially in Bohemia and Moravia, where children were taken from families and placed in racial assessment centers. Girls deemed suitable were separated, detained, and in some cases raped by SS officers under the claim of improving the bloodline. In Belarus and Ukraine, the violence escalated further. Entire villages were cleared out. Children were inspected for Aryan features. If they matched the criteria, they were taken immediately. Parents who resisted were beaten or killed. The SS had orders to remove the child, wipe out their identity, and train them as future Germans. The kidnapping process was systematic. Teams of doctors, midwives, and SS officials would visit orphanages, hospitals, and even public schools. Children were lined up, inspected like livestock, and those who passed were labeled racially valuable. Some children were even pulled from Red Cross shelters. Others were taken from trains of deportees on their way to labor camps. Once selected, the child was taken to one of several transit centers, such as the one in Łódź, which served as a sorting point. There they were renamed, issued forged birth documents, and taught to forget their native language. Their original names, birthdays, and family details were destroyed or hidden in SS archives. Some children were too young to speak. Toddlers barely old enough to walk were sent to German foster families or Lebensborn nurseries. These children were forced to speak German and told they had always been part of the Reich. Any sign of resistance, crying for their parents, or speaking Polish was punished. Many of these children ended up in homes in Bavaria, Austria, and Western Germany. They were raised to believe they were German by birth. In some cases, the adoptive families had no idea the child had been kidnapped. As the Nazi regime started collapsing in 1944, efforts to erase evidence of the kidnappings increased. Documents were destroyed, children were relocated, but the damage had already been done. According to post-war investigations, at least 200,000 children were taken from Poland alone. Thousands more came from Ukraine, Belarus, Slovakia, and the Baltic states. Most never found their way back to their real families. And that was just one part of the horror. Lebensborn homes were designed to look peaceful. Large villas in the countryside, clean facilities with tidy gardens, quiet halls, and polished floors. From the outside, they resembled private clinics or elite boarding schools. But behind those calm walls was a system built entirely around control, ideology, and racial engineering. Inside, everything followed a strict routine. The moment a woman entered, her freedom ended. Her meals, sleeping hours, and medical checkups were scheduled with precision. Nurses and midwives reported directly to SS officials and followed detailed protocols laid out by Russia. Women were assigned numbers. Their conversations were often monitored. Some were discouraged from forming friendships with each other. Medical staff tracked every stage of their pregnancy, ensuring no health issues interfered with the goal of a perfect birth. Pain relief during labor was sometimes denied. Births were timed, documented, and reviewed. Immediately after delivery, babies were taken to infant wings or nurseries, where SS caregivers conducted constant evaluations. For most mothers, keeping the baby was not an option. In fact, they didn't even get to hold their child for more than a few minutes. The child would be placed in a racial adoption system managed by the SS. Only selected Nazi Party families or SS members could apply to adopt these babies, after passing their own background checks and racial evaluations. Mothers who begged to keep their children were often rejected outright, or told they were unfit to raise them without a husband. Some women were left empty-handed and were forbidden from ever seeking contact with the child again. A few who tried to return later were denied entry or threatened with consequences. The children raised in Lebensborn nurseries were immersed in Nazi ideology from infancy. As early as age 3, they were enrolled in pre-kindergarten programs that taught Nazi values, racial superiority, loyalty to the Führer, and the importance of purity. Toys, songs, and books were all chosen to reinforce these ideas. Even bedtime stories were propaganda tools. Teachers and caregivers praised traits like obedience, discipline, and sacrifice for the Reich. Children were rewarded for reporting disloyal behavior among each other. This psychological conditioning aimed to erase any trace of personal identity and replace it with absolute loyalty to the Nazi vision. Despite the warmth of these buildings, the real atmosphere was cold and sterile. No personal photos were allowed. Emotional expression was discouraged. Every child was told they were part of something greater than themselves. but they were never truly seen as individuals. Every decision, down to a child's name, was calculated. Their lives weren't nurtured. They were engineered. And when things didn't go as planned, the consequences were deadly. Babies who failed the Nazi standards were quietly removed from their mothers without explanation. Some were sent to so-called special care homes that were part of the Action T4 euthanasia program, which officially began in October 1939. These institutions operated under the cover of medical care, but were designed for systematic killing. The methods used were horrifying. Many infants were injected with barbiturates, starved to death, or simply left unattended until they died. The medical staff filed false death certificates, listing pneumonia, heart failure, or birth complications as the cause. Parents were rarely notified in time to protest, and when they were told the child died naturally. The criteria for elimination could be shockingly arbitrary. A baby might be killed simply for being born premature, for having a cleft palate, or for failing a heart test. No appeals were allowed. In the larger context, this process was part of the Nazi obsession with cleansing the gene pool. While Lebensborn was meant to increase births, it only wanted certain kinds of children, those who fit perfectly into Hitler's racial fantasy. By 1941, as demands grew, even more pressure was placed on these programs to produce results. There was less tolerance for imperfection, fewer chances for mercy. That's when the Nazi regime doubled down on Lebensborn in 1942, when the Eastern Front was collapsing. More homes were established across occupied countries, especially in places where the population matched Nazi racial ideals. One of the largest expansions happened in France, where thousands of German soldiers were stationed. These men were encouraged to form relationships with local women, many of whom were young, isolated, and struggling to survive during wartime shortages. Once pregnant, these women were sent to special maternity homes, like the one in La Morlaix near Paris. Some went willingly, others were misled, and some had no real choice at all. The SS classified them based on physical features and ancestry, then assigned them care according to their racial value. After birth, many of these children were taken from their mothers and sent to Germany, where they were placed with Nazi families. Most of the mothers never saw them again. When the war ended, these women faced brutal punishment, not from the Nazis, but from their own communities. In France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, thousands of women were accused of horizontal collaboration. Many were dragged from their homes, shaved bald, beaten, and paraded through the streets while crowds spat on them. Some were jailed without trial. Others lost their jobs, families, and children. The children, labeled as products of the enemy, were often bullied, ostracized, and denied basic rights. In schools, they were called Nazi bastards. In homes, they were sometimes hidden or sent to orphanages to escape public shame. By 1945, Lebensborn had left scars not only on those born inside the program, but on every community it touched. From Paris to Prague, and from Oslo to Krakow, it left behind a trail of stolen identities, broken families, and permanent silence. But its end didn't come in silence. It came with chaos. When Nazi officials tried to hide what they had done, in Lebensborn homes, records were shredded or burned. Birth certificates, adoption papers, and medical files vanished. The goal was to erase every trace. Nurses and staff fled. Children were left alone in once tightly controlled buildings. But Allied forces moved in quickly. In May 1945, they found the homes abandoned, but not empty. At places like Steinhüring, they discovered confused toddlers, dressed in SS-like baby clothes. Some older girls had bruises or were pregnant. The documents that remained gave chilling insight. Lists of racially pure traits, medical logs, and transfer orders. Some homes looked more like hospitals, others like military barracks. The people who designed this system were gone. Heinrich Himmler, the mastermind, swallowed a cyanide pill on May 23, 1945, after being captured. But the damage was already done, and the children had no idea what world they had just been thrown into. They became orphans overnight. Some were barely old enough to speak. Many didn't even know their real names. Soldiers and aid workers moved quickly to place them in shelters, orphanages, or with foster families, but reunification was rare and chaotic. In some cases, Allied soldiers adopted them and took them abroad. Others stayed behind, marked by silence and shame. Many children from France, Norway, and Poland were placed with families they had never met. A few were mistakenly returned to the wrong relatives. In Norway, these children were seen as enemies. Some were labeled mentally ill and institutionalized. Others were bullied in school or denied basic rights. For years, their identities were kept from them. It wasn't until 2007 that the Norwegian government publicly acknowledged what had happened and issued a formal apology. But the scars left behind couldn't be fixed with words. The program was mentioned during the Nuremberg trials, but only briefly. Unlike the SS death camps, it didn't have gas chambers or mass graves, so prosecutors struggled to prove direct crimes. A few doctors, midwives, and nurses were questioned. Some admitted to involvement, but claimed they were just doing their jobs under pressure. By 1947, investigations had started to fade. Cold War tensions took priority. Western nations focused on rebuilding Europe and avoiding political friction. Lebensborn became a hidden chapter. Survivors stayed silent. Some were too ashamed. Others didn't even know they were part of the program. Governments didn't encourage questions. Schools never taught the story. It wasn't until decades later that survivors began piecing together their past. Public archives opened. Journalists and filmmakers started asking questions. Books were published. TV interviews aired. Some of these children, now elderly, still search for answers. For them, this story isn't history. It's personal, and it never really ended.